All right, so a couple things before we get started here. I updated Canvas this morning so that under the assignments tab, that last module reading was turned in. So I have it set so it's now dropping your lowest module reading. Okay. After this week, we'll kind of cover module 13. You'll have a quiz after Thursday's class due next Monday. Once that due date passes, I'll do a similar thing, update Canvas so it's dropping your lowest quiz. And then after Thursday's class, we'll have the remaining 2 in-class quizzes today and Thursday. I'll update it so that it's dropping your 4 lowest in-class quizzes. So the only other thing we have left, as the syllabus kind of states, we had 5 Canvas discussions. We've only had 4 at this point. So I'll get another one posted when I get back to my office today. It'll be the 5th and final Canvas discussion. That's due at the end of the day next Wednesday. All right, so a little bit less, kind of quicker turnaround here, just over a week to work on that. Once that's in, once we kind of have everything else in after next Wednesday, you should have kind of a pretty good idea once those get graded by the end of the week, what your grade is in every category going to that final exam, with the exception of your final exam score. Okay. I'll also kind of mention last week, we won't have class on Tuesday next week. I'll post a video that kind of has me working through a set of review questions. And then Thursday, we'll have class as usual next week, where basically I'll just be kind of fielding the class for questions. We'll just be doing a review from those practice exams. Those have been up there for a while on Canvas. I would kind of highly suggest start working through those. Other than that, I think that should take care of most of the housekeeping stuff. Other than I will mention, as I'm kind of having my TAs help me kind of grade and go through those 4th Canvas discussions, right? I mentioned this multiple times in class, the format, the instructions were clear. You should have had basically 2 original posts, just like the old Canvas discussions. Now, I kind of mentioned a lot of you, for whatever reason, put both of your responses in the same post. It makes it a little bit more difficult to grade, but as long as you identified what those were, I'll grade it as those 2 original posts. And then 2 replies to other students. So this final Canvas discussion is going to look very similar. After what we talked about today, you can likely get through a good portion of this. You want to wait till after Thursday's class. We have a more thorough description of these, what we call monopolistic competitive markets. This might be a little bit easier to kind of tackle and get on and get done. So on this one, you've got 1 original post where you post this article and kind of the response or the prompt that I gave you to put into a generative AI tool. Some of you even told me that you're using AI to evaluate AI's response. It's not the goal of the assignment. The goal of the assignment is to learn how to effectively analyze and use these tools kind of moving forward, right? So the assignment is to get a response from AI and then use what we talk about in class to analyze why it's correct or incorrect. AI is not, it's going to tell you that it's correct. It just gave you the response. It's not going to give you a good analysis of why it might be wrong, right? Or why it is wrong, right? Based off what we talked about. So you get your response from AI, putting in this prompt, you then evaluate it yourself, right? I have kind of a second article that has a data source in it. Once again, copy post the link, put in the prompt, and then evaluate why that response is correct. Or here, I think I take it a step further, not just why that response is correct, but what would be, so I think I have it ask you to give me a state, or AI is going to tell you a state and a type of institution. You have to tell me why there would be another answer that might be more correct, or that should be more correct, given your, reasoning or whatever, your support behind why it would be a different state or a different type of institution. So that'll be a little more obvious as you read through the instruction of the assignment, but 2 original posts, and then you will respond to 2 other students. One where you kind of evaluate their analysis of their response they got, and then a second one where you kind of, once again, kind of make an argument as to why their evaluation might not line up with your AI's response and the evaluation you had of that, right? So it's getting you to kind of think through these responses we're getting and try to evaluate them, not using AI, right? AI already gave you an answer, right? You need to understand why that answer might be incorrect, or some nuances based on what we talked about in class as to why that won't be the case. Right? And I'm giving you all the same prompt, so I know that it's writing at a level of difficulty, and going to be pulling from resources that are specific to that prompt, not specific to everything we've talked about in class. Okay, so 2 original posts, 2 replies to other students. Those are the 4 components you need to get all 20 points. Okay, so that's the fifth and final Canvas discussion that we do the end of next Wednesday. I'll have my TAs try to help me grade those by the end of next week. So we have an idea about where our grades are at going into that final, which is the Wednesday of finals week. And we'll talk more about that Thursday and then next week as well. I also will have some things to mention about this at the end of class, so we'll kind of hold off on that. But there's no other questions for me. We'll kind of dive into material.
How many modules?
So I already said, after this module quiz, I'm going to change it to drop your lowest. All right. So I think that, unless I'm getting my classes incorrect here, but if we go all the way back, we look at the syllabus here. Let's go down here. This is where my answer to a lot of things is check the syllabus. Oh, sorry, I misspoke. Yeah, I'll have it set to drop your two lowest quizzes, right? Lowest module reading, lowest two quizzes, and then lowest 4 in-class attendances. All right. Any other questions before we dive into material here today? Got a lot to get through. So we talked about kind of these two extremes, which was we have perfect competition, and then we have monopoly markets, which there is no competition. Those were our two extremes. Last week, we talked about some game theoretical approaches to kind of an in-between, which is we have two, or I said you can kind of extend it to a few firms. The math is just hard, right? So we're going to look at another kind of in-between this week, which is what we call monopolistically competitive markets. So like the kind of term references, it's a combination of monopoly markets and perfectly competitive markets. It's somewhere, it's like a mashup of the two, okay? Excuse me. So what we're going to have is in these monopolistic competitive markets, just like a perfect competitive market, we have many, many buyers and sellers. Now, we're also going to have free firm entry and exit. So this isn't like a monopolist where there might be barriers to entry. Somewhere we talk about natural monopolies or maybe just legal restrictions with patents. Here, we're going to have, just like a perfectly competitive market, firms can freely enter and exit at will. And then unlike a perfectly competitive market, more similar to a monopolist, they're not all selling the exact same product. They're selling slightly differentiated products. So this would be the idea of like clothing. A bunch of different companies sell t-shirts, but they're slightly different quality. They have different things on them. They're different colors. They're different tapers, whatever the characteristics are. They try to differentiate their product from other t-shirts. I think in the model reading example, like hamburgers, right? McDonald's, Burger King have hamburgers, so I have fast food hamburgers. So that's different than the hamburgers you get from Five Guys or Shake Shack. Or Shake Shack, right? So we kind of have these same product category, but each company is selling a slightly different product. So it's kind of a mashup of the two. Looks similar to perfectly competitive markets in some ways, closer to monopolists in other ways. And we'll kind of talk through what differences this will make. Okay. So here's kind of just a summary of these. We can kind of see monopolists and competitive markets look similar to perfectly competitive, lots of sellers, free firm entry and exit, but they don't have the exact same product. It's not completely unique, but it is different than the others, right? It's different than all the other products in that market. So what is this going to do for us? So today we're primarily going to focus on the short run and then kind of move to the long run towards the end of class. But what these monopolistic competitive markets will do, right, is they've got some market power. So the way in which we solve these graphs or these examples is going to be very similar to what we did for a monopolist. We'll kind of mention why it is different, but at least the initial setup, it looks very similar to monopolist. Any market we look at, how do we choose the profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Now, just like the monopolist, what the monopolistic competitive firm will then do is it has some market power. So it then goes up to its demand curve to set the price. And this two-step process like we had for a monopolist. So we go up to that demand curve to figure out at the profit maximizing quantity, what should the price we set be? Okay. Now, what this results in, and I mentioned this term in monopoly when we were looking at monopolies, but we'll use it a lot today, is this idea of a markup. So because we're going up to the demand curve, we said the price we set will always be above our marginal cost, and that difference is going to be what we call the markup. How much higher am I setting the price relative to how much it's costing me to provide that last unit to the market? Okay. So we're kind of reusing, this is where I think the final, although it's more difficult in that we're looking at more comprehensive examples, putting a lot of the things we've talked about into one model. We're reusing a lot this week of things we've already talked about. I think you'll see that today. Okay, so the topics are like across different markets, but we're reusing the similar kind of set of topics. So what are the differences in the demand for a monopolist and competitive firm going to look like relative to the other two markets, perfectly competitive and a monopolist? Okay. So we'll make these comparisons, right? The first I'll think about is if I had a perfectly competitive market, what's that demand curve going to look like? So for any one firm, if it's perfectly competitive, we said they had to take the price as given. I'm seeing some people do it with their hands. The firm in a perfectly competitive market, their demand curve is simply whatever that equilibrium price is, which also then consequently became their marginal revenue. So PC is just my subscript for perfectly competitive here. Okay. Now, they faced some increasing marginal costs. We might have like this initial decreasing portion, but we kind of just focus. We know that profit maximizing quantity will be somewhere where diminishing returns takes over. So we can kind of draw it this way. Essentially, in a perfectly competitive market, marginal cost was our supply curve. Where would that marginal cost be equal to marginal revenue? Out here at this quantity. And then we can't get away with charging any other price than that equilibrium. This was our perfectly competitive firm. Okay. So they face this horizontal demand curve. They choose the profit maximizing quantity using marginal revenue equal marginal cost. This was our result. Now, we typically look at this in terms of the market, but this would be kind of what any one firm does. This is their demand curve. Now, a monopolistically competitive firm, there's an overall demand for hamburgers, but McDonald's faces a portion of that demand curve. Okay. So they have some control over the price because their product is a little bit different than others. So just like a monopolist, they're not going to face a horizontal demand curve. Their demand curve might be downward sloping, right? So these monopolistically competitive firms, they face a downward sloping demand curve. And then just like a monopolist, their product is a little bit different. So they're going to set the price for their product, right? McDonald's sets the price for their hamburgers. They don't get to set the price for Five Guys. Right? So if they're setting a single price for their product, they don't make it based off demand. What are they also going to have like a monopolist? A twice as steep. We've got to know this marginal revenue curve, right? Just like the monopolist, they face the demand curve. The marginal revenue curve they make decisions based off of is a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So monopolistic competitive markets face a similar thing. Okay. How would they then choose that profit maximizing quantity? Or marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? So they're going to set the quantity down here. Notice, and this is a good, nice intuitive result. If I have some market power, a monopolist, when they had complete market power, they restricted quantity a lot. So I can't restrict it as much if I'm a monopolistically competitive firm because there are other substitutes for my product, but I can restrict it some. So the quantity they produce relative to a perfectly competitive firm, so you can almost think about this is the demand that each firm in a monopolistic competitive market faces. Their quantity is going to be a little bit lower than a perfectly competitive market. And then just like a monopolist, the second step is they set the price for their product. How much are consumers willing and able to pay? Well, that's represented by our demand curve. So we go up to the demand curve to then set the price. Okay. So if we're comparing these markets, right, the monopolistically competitive quantity at the firm level will be less than that of a perfectly competitive firm. And then intuitively, if I'm comparing the prices that those firms set in these two different types of markets, price. If I have some market power, am I going to be able to charge a higher or lower price? Well, with complete market power, monopolists chose a much higher price. With some, might not be quite as high, but it is going to be higher than a perfectly competitive firm would be able to choose. So this is kind of comparing our demand curves between these two types of markets and kind of what their resulting price and quantity decisions would be. Okay. Any questions on this? So you hopefully see when we're looking at these monopolistic competitive markets, at least right now, looks very similar to a monopoly. Okay. Now, here's where we're going to not just compare them to a perfectly competitive market. We're now going to compare the monopolistically competitive market. It's a lot to say, to a monopoly market, right? So in a monopoly market, they face the entire demand curve, right? They're going to have whatever their marginal costs are, and then they make decisions based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, right? So this was our monopolist. They set that quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. They then go up to their demand curve. That's the price consumers are willing and able to pay. That was going to be the price they set. So once again, we've covered this concept. I'm just kind of reusing what we talked about with monopolists. Now, there's going to be two differences in the demand that a monopolistically competitive market faces. So if I'm one firm, I face the entire, let's say I'm the only person selling hamburgers. I have all of demand for hamburgers. If there's now 5 firms, we all sell slightly different versions of this product. Right? Each one of us is only going to have a portion of the overall demand. We're splitting it now with other firms. So if I'm splitting the entire market demand with other firms, relative to if I faced the entire demand for that product, my demand curve is going to be, if I face 100% of something and now I'm only getting 20%, my demand curve is going to be lower, right? Or shifted to the left. So if we're thinking about the demand for these monopolistically competitive firms, it's going to be smaller or less than a monopolist's. Okay. So we're going to start out like somewhere down here. Now, the second difference in a monopolistic competitive demand curve relative to a monopolist, so the demand for these monopolistically competitive firms, if I'm the only person selling something, we said, if you want to buy it, you have to buy it from me. So if I change the price, if you really need this, you still are going to buy it from me. So what is your demand? Relatively inelastic or a pretty steep demand curve. If McDonald's jacks up the price of their hamburgers, what are you maybe more likely to do? Buy it from someone else, not buy it from them. So for their product, because there are now substitutes, their demand relative to if they were the only product is going to be more elastic. You can be more responsive. More elastic means it's going to be flatter. So not only do they face a smaller demand curve, right? So this is kind of each firm. It's also going to be flatter. They then make a decision based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So this is the marginal revenue of the monopolistic competitive market. Once again, subscripting MC, that's monopolistic competitive, just so I don't have a whole bunch of words on here. Well, they solve for that profit maximizing quantity the same way a monopolist would. It's just they face a different marginal revenue and demand curve. So they set the quantity down here. They set the price up here. So what's the kind of comparison we would have here? The quantity that a monopolist chooses relative to a monopolistically competitive firm, right, is going to be greater, right? Because they face a much larger portion of the overall demand curve. Now, what's going to be true about the price? Well, the price that monopolist sets is going to be also greater than the monopolistically competitive firm sets. Okay. Now, there's a slight caveat to this that we'll probably address on Thursday, but at least for what we're doing right now, thinking about these two things that make demand differently. So the second was it's more elastic, or we could think about this as flat. Do you have a question? Any other questions on this idea? So I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but really what we want to start out with is thinking about these demand differences between these markets and then kind of the resulting outcomes. Okay. So I'm going to add one thing in here that we'll talk more about later on, but I think since I have the graph, I think it makes sense to revisit a concept that we talked about before with monopolists, and I already brought up today. What is the difference? If I look at this quantity for a monopolist, here is their marginal cost at that quantity. The difference between price and marginal cost is what we define as the markup. How much higher am I setting my price than the additional cost of that last unit? So in a perfectly competitive market, the markup was actually what? 0. The price they were setting, they couldn't set any price other than that equilibrium. Price is exactly equal to marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. We wanted to take it a step further, going back and reviewing, is equal to average total cost, is equal to the minimum point of the average total. Everything's equal in that long run for a perfectly competitive firm. Here with a monopolist, we actually have a markup. Okay. And then if we then compare that to, well, what about the monopolistic competitive firm? Well, once again, the intuition is kind of nice here. If I have less market power, right, I can't set as high of a price, and the markup I'm going to be able to, realize is also going to be lower, right? I'm going to be closer than a monopolist would be to that perfectly competitive outcome. So if I look at here, what's the difference between the price? See if this works. There you go. So what's the difference between the price and that marginal cost value of the monopolistic competitive firm? That's going to be their markup. Okay. So what do we notice about these markups? The markup of a monopoly market is greater than that of a monopolistically competitive market, right? And that's because the monopolistic competitive firm has less market power. There are actually now substitutes for their profit. So when we identify these profit maximizing quantities, profit maximizing prices, we can then also compare them to our marginal cost of those quantities to determine what that firm's markup will be. Okay. And we'll reuse this idea of a markup later on today and then also Thursday. Any questions here before we keep moving? Okay, so we'll take a step back a little bit here. So I think about here, I've got my demand curve for a perfectly competitive firm, monopolist. The demand for monopolist competitive is going to be a little bit lower to the left, so it starts at a lower value, and it's flatter because it was more elastic, right? And we kind of took it a step further than these slides. That's why I kind of left this blank. I kind of drew this out for us. So we're now going to go think about, okay, we solved these monopolistic competitive market decisions, this profit maximizing quantity price, very similar to that of monopoly. However, with a monopolist, we always had profits that were positive. Similar to a perfectly competitive market, the short-run profits of a monopolistically competitive firm can be positive or negative in the short run. Okay, so here I think about they've got their demand curve, they're twice as steep marginal revenue curve. If I were to draw in their cost structure, so once again, we're reusing module 9 material, my marginal cost should hit my average total cost at its minimum point. Okay, so that's what I have depicted here. What is the profit maximizing quantity? The marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. That's the same in every market, just the marginal revenue curves look different. I then go up to the demand curve to set my price. So in this example, right, my price is above the average total cost. So if we go back to thinking about our profit equation, so what was our profit equation equal to? Right? So we said profits are equal to the quantity we're selling times the difference between price and average. It's the exact same profit equation we've been using. So if price is ever above my average total costs, this is where profits were positive. Okay. Now, just to revisit some concepts before we go a little bit further in the slides, and since we're already here, if price is below my average total costs, I know that profits are what? Well, quantity is always positive. So if price is below average total cost, profits must be negative. If profits are negative, though, I have two scenarios. If profits are negative, when we had these perfectly competitive markets, what's the next thing we had to determine? In the short run, do they stay open or shut down temporarily? So when do they shut down? When price was less than average variable costs. So if price is below my average variable cost, yes, our profits are negative and we choose to shut down. If it's above my average variable costs, but below average total, profits will be negative, but I'm going to choose to stay open to minimize my losses. Okay. Now, some things that we'll look at in the slides in here in just a few seconds. And I think here, it's actually a little bit nicer than perfectly competitive markets because we have a nice visualization as to why this is the case, why we shut down and stay open. So if I stay open, my profits, we use that exact same equation. It's just that price is below average total cost, so I know they'll be negative. Now, if I shut down, what were my profits equal to? Well, if I rewrite my profit equation, so here was our profit equation. What are my average total costs equal to? Yeah, my average variable plus my average fixed. So I'm just rewriting this out. If I rearrange this equation, and we had this before, well, what is quantity times my average fixed cost? Well, average fixed costs are my fixed costs over quantity. If I multiply both sides by quantity, quantity times my average fixed cost would just be my fixed costs. And just using algebra to rewrite this. Now, this equation makes it a little bit easier for me to see that decision between shutting down and staying open. Because if I shut down, what is quantity? 0. My profits would just be, if I can get my fingers, there we go, negative whatever my fixed costs are. If I stay open and price is below average variable cost, what would be the sign of this? Negative. So my profits would be an even larger negative value. That's why when price is below average variable cost, it makes no sense to stay open. We should just shut down to minimize our losses. Now, one thing that we'll use later on is if my profits are, if I shut down, here was my profits. What is my fixed cost? I can write this as my average fixed cost times quantity. What are my average fixed costs? The difference between my average total and my average variable. So we're going to have a way to look at this visually about how we identify this in a graph. So the quantity we're producing times the difference between average total and average variable cost. That will tell me my fixed costs, in which case if I shut down, my profits are simply negative whatever those fixed costs are. Okay? So we're going to kind of reuse a lot of this. You're not going to have to do the algebra every single time. We can just kind of know when I shut down, I've got my negative fixed costs, here are my profits. So we'll think through these different scenarios. So here we started out with an easy one. Profits were positive, right? Price is above average. I don't have a decision to make, right? Stay open. Now, if at that profit maximizing quantity, when marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, if my price is below that demand curve, sorry, not demand, if my price on that demand curve is below my average total cost curve, I know profits will be negative. So I then have the second decision to make, which is, do I stay open or shut down? Well, I don't have the information I need here because in order to determine if I stay open or shut down, what do I need? Not my average total cost, but my average variable cost. Right? So I've got two scenarios. I could have positive or negative profits, but we then said I need to make the decision, second decision if my profits are negative, which is, do I stay open to minimize my losses or do I simply shut down? So we're going to look at that visually here, but it's the same decision that a perfectly competitive firm had to make in the short run. If profits are negative, do I stay open or shut down? And it's the same rule. I shut down if price is below my average variable cost. Okay. So let's think about a depiction of this. Okay. So let's say this was my monopolistically competitive firm. They face this demand, twice the steep marginal revenue. Profit maximizing quantity, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We then go up to the demand curve to set the price. Once again, we're reusing this. It's the exact same kind of way we solve these monopoly market models. The only difference is in the short run, like they were a monopoly, they always had positive profits. Here we could have negative profits. This is an example where the price I'm setting is below my average total cost. So profits are negative. What would the value of my profits be? The quantity I'm selling, that would be the width of my rectangle, times the difference between my price and average total cost. That's the height of this rectangle. This represents my profits, but they will be negative. Now, do I stay open or shut down here? Well, my price is above average variable, so I should stay open to minimize my losses. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we take it one step further and think about why shutting down makes sense? Okay. So we continue to operate, stay open, prices above average variable cost. What if I had a scenario like this? We'll ignore the markup part for a second. So once again, set my profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Go up the demand curve, set the price. Well, that price is below my average total cost, so I know my profits are negative. Second decision I have to make, do I shut down? Here, would I stay open or shut down? Shut down. Why? Because that price I'm setting is below my average variable cost. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, we made the same comparison. It's just that our price was this nice horizontal line. We didn't have to find the price. It was whatever the equilibrium price in the market was. So price is below average variable cost, I should shut down. Now, I could also, just to kind of start to reiterate this concept, even if I was looking at a depiction like this where I know profits are negative, I can still determine the markup. So this is a little counterintuitive, but even if profits are negative, monopolistically competitive firms will still have a markup. They're still setting the price above the marginal cost of that last unit they produced. So we can still identify that markup, which was just the difference between our price and marginal cost at that profit maximizing quantity. Okay. Anybody with me before I take it a little bit further? Okay, so we should shut down. I'll give you a visualization as to why. What are my profits if I shut down? Right? Well, sorry, if I shut down. If I stay open, right? Well, it's the quantity I'm producing, that would be the width of this rectangle, times the difference between my price and average total cost. That's our profit equation, if we stay open. So this would represent my losses if I stay open. Okay? Just that quantity I'm producing, times the difference between price and average total cost, using that same profit equation. Now, what were my profits if I shut down? Simply negative my fixed costs. Well, remember, I said another way of writing this is we could rewrite fixed costs as average fixed times quantity, and average fixed is just the difference between average total and average variable. So if I go back to my graph, if I can identify these at a specific quantity, I can calculate my profits or my fixed costs. Right? So if I look here, what's the difference between my average total and my average variable costs? Would be the height of this kind of rectangle times the quantity at that point. If I shut down, that would represent negative whatever my fixed costs are. So if I shut down, here are my profits, simply negative whatever my fixed costs are. Is this loss greater or less than this loss? Less. So which is better? Shutting down. I lose less. And that was the decision we would make if we compared that price to my average variable cost. So I think here it gives us a nicer visualization than a perfectly competitive market did for why shutting down actually provides me with a lower kind of loss, right? Or a loss closer to zero, right? We want to have a smaller negative profit value if we're trying to maximize profits, okay? Any questions here before we keep moving? Okay. So take a look at this in-class quiz here today. I'll adjust this. So I think the code, this will show up on the quizzes tab or the main homepage on Canvas. I believe the code is 32.54 or 32.54. We'll double check this here. So that code should be 32.54. So I'm going to give you guys the next 5 minutes or so. Talk with the people around you, work through these. You've got 2 questions, same graph. Oh, sorry. I meant 17. Hold on. Thank you. That would help, right? So I'll go 1 minute longer since it took us a little hiccup here. So 32.54 should get you into that quiz. Got the due date set to be 10/18 now. So the next like 5-6 minutes or so, and then I'll kind of give you the prompt to make sure you're getting it submitted. Talk with the people around you. You've got the same visual depiction in both kind of problems. Based off what we talked about, shouldn't be too bad. Okay, so kind of reconvene in about 5 minutes here. So probably go through this one together. So I would highly encourage you, once again, talk to the people around you, work together, make sure you're getting these correct. Okay. I got it.
Yeah, I think we're doing something. Yes. I think we're fine. I think I'm done.
I even get to open it and it shows 0 2.
So go back in. Go to the home page. On the quiz.
Sorry.
All right, so start wrapping up your work here. Had it set to be due at 10:18, so make sure you're getting it submitted prior to 10:18, right? We're going to talk through it, but I won't get through the answers by the time it's due, so make sure you're hitting submit now, okay? So we've got kind of both of these problems. We've got a monopolistic competitive market depicted. We have, just like a monopolist, a downward sloping demand curve. They face a portion of demand. Just to revisit the concepts, that demand will be what relative to a monopolist? More flatter or more elastic. However, they're setting the price for their product, so the marginal revenue curve will still be twice as steep, not as the overall demand for the product, but the demand for their specific product. They then make the profit maximizing quantity decision, just like a monopolist or a perfectly competitive firm would, which is where the marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. Now, a perfectly competitive firm, it was easy for them to set the price because they don't get to set the price, just whatever the equilibrium price was. For a monopolistic competitive firm, they're setting the price for their product just like a monopolist would. So they look at that profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and they then go up to the demand curve. Okay. So in this example, my price that I can set is above average total cost. So if I ask you a follow-up question, what's true about the profits of this firm? They are, the price is above average total cost. Everyone in unison should say positive. Okay. So if I have positive profits at that profit maximizing quantity of 6, because that price of 12 was above my average total cost of 9, right? I've got positive profits. Okay. Any questions on that one before we keep moving? Now, if I had a different example here where profits were negative, I would then need an additional curve to make my decision, which would be what? I stay open or shut down if price is above or below average variable. I gave you guys the depiction. What did I add? Average variable costs, right? So if I had a second example where my average total costs are a little bit higher, same graph. So we had that same quantity of 6, same price of 12, but price is now below my average total cost. So I know profits are negative. Price is below average total cost. So right away, I could rule out which answers here. 18 and 48. I know profits are negative. So the next step is, what's the value of my profits? Well, do I stay open or shut down? At that quantity of 6 and that price of 12, is my price above or below my average variable cost? Is 12 greater than 9? Yes, so I should stay open. I use the same profit equation. I take that difference between price and average total cost, which is now what? 12 and 14. All right, so -2. Price is below average. So -2 times that quantity of 6 should give me that -12 value. Okay. I'm going to throw in one thing that's a little bit trickier, tougher here. So are there any questions on this? Let's just assume for a second that that price was not above average variable cost. Okay. So let's assume I had a lower demand curve, the price is lower, and price is below average variable. What should I choose to do? Shut down. Okay. So if I were to have to calculate my profits from shutting down, well, now I sell nothing, but what are my profits? Negative, whatever my fixed costs were. We said, how can we calculate fixed costs from a graph? We would look at any quantity here, and some, there are going to be some quantities where I could do this, but not all of them make sense. Usually I give you a nice depiction where whatever quantity you would have been using to profit maximize if you did stay open, you can use that same quantity to determine your fixed cost. So we said our fixed cost would be equal to the quantity that we're looking at times the difference between average total and average variable cost. So at that quantity of 6, if I did shut down, what would my profits be? That difference between average variable and average total. So what? 14 minus 9. So 5 times 6 would be -30. Right? That would be my profits if I shut down here. Those would be my fixed costs. Now I didn't shut down. So what hopefully is true, oh yeah, if I stayed open, my losses were what? We said -12. If I shut down here, they are -30. I should have stayed open. Right? I made that correct decision basing kind of comparing that price to average variable cost, but I could prove that to myself calculating the values if I stayed open or shut down of profits. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So we've got one other thing we can start to think about, which is we know that we have these similar short-run decisions that perfectly competitive markets had. If we have free firm entry and exit, we get another kind of counterintuitive result this time, which is even though these firms have market power, we actually end up with long-run profits that are equal to 0. Now, the reason why is the same reason, same mechanism, I should say, as a perfectly competitive market. So let's say, right, I've got these firms and they're currently charging a price above their marginal cost, or they have a markup. If that price is above average total cost, the profits are price above average total, profits are positive. What are other firms going to want to do? Enter that market. As they enter, there is no universal equilibrium price now, but as more firms enter, so like, let's say like over COVID, there was like, I don't know, all these products on TikTok and things that people were needing in their home. People were making money, right? So what did a lot of firms do? They started producing these products. The market was very oversaturated for some of these things. They entered the market. Well, as they enter the market, I'm now splitting the overall demand with more firms. So what's going to happen to my demand curve? It's going to be a smaller portion, or it's going to be lower. Right? So if we started out with a scenario where I had positive profits, firm is choosing marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. At that quantity, go up the demand curve to set the price. Price is above average total cost. Profits are positive. What do other firms want to do here? Enter that market. But as they enter that market, and I apologize, there's different. I updated my PowerPoint, and it's not updated on this computer for some reason. My images didn't shift here, right? Hopefully, the color coding you can kind of see. This is my first and second demand curve here. Right? So as firms enter the market, I get a smaller portion of demand, or my demand curve shifts to the left. Well, if marginal revenue is twice as steep as my demand curve, my marginal revenue curve also shifts to the left. So now, where is the profit maximizing quantity of the firm? Well, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So if everything's shifting to the left, it's going to be a lower quantity. But they now go up to their new demand curve 2, to set the price, right? What do we now notice? As firms entered this market, each existing firm had a smaller portion of demand until their profits are equal to what here? Well, price is exactly equal to my average total cost. So profits are now price equal to average total cost. My profits are 0. Same mechanism in a perfectly competitive market. When there's positive profits, firms enter. Now, instead here, it doesn't drive down a universal price. It drives down the demand curve each firm faces. But what impact does that still have? What happened to the price the firm can get away with charging? It's now lower, right? And that's because as firms enter, there is now more competition. So as firms enter, we get profits driven down to 0 in the long run. Once again, I get lazy with how I'm talking about this. It's economic profits. So there's no other industry where I could take my same resources and get higher accounting profits. So when profits are equal to 0, economic profits, now is there any incentive for a firm to enter that market? No. If they entered it, it would just drive everyone's profits to be negative. Now, if profits were negative, what's going to happen? All right. Well, if I had a market where at the profit maximizing quantity, or marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, they go up to the demand curve, up the price is below average total cost, my profits are negative. What are some firms moving towards the long run going to have to do? Exit. I can't hemorrhage money forever, right? So as they exit, the remaining firms, what happens to their demand curve? They're now gaining a higher proportion of overall demand. So their demand curve is going to shift to the right. Now, as more firms exit the market, I get a higher portion of overall demand, whereas the new profit maximizing quantity with marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, going up to my new demand curve to set the price, I now have a price that's exactly equal to average total cost. As these firms exit the market, I end up at that long run equilibrium where profits are equal to 0. So same result in the long run for a monopolistically competitive market and a perfectly competitive market in the sense that profits go to 0. Any questions on that before we kind of make this a little bit more difficult here? Okay. So, you don't necessarily have to draw these out every single time. It gets us kind of similar results as those perfectly competitive markets. As firms exited the market, what happened to the quantity and price that those firms produce? Quantity went up, but the price they could charge for their product, well, it also went up, right? And so profits are exactly equal to 0. Now, I'll point something out here and we'll kind of have a better depiction of it in a second. But in this long run equilibrium, notice at the point where profits are 0, it won't be the same point as a perfectly competitive firm would get to. Because in the long run, what point on the average total cost curve do all firms get to? The efficient scale of production, which is where our per unit costs or our average total costs were at their lowest point. What hits average total cost at its lowest point? So where would a perfectly competitive firm end up? Right there, right? Right where marginal cost hits average total cost at its minimum point. So notice the monopolistic competitive firm is not quite there, okay? So even though long run profits are 0, it's not going to be the same point or quantity as a perfectly competitive firm would get to. So what do you think we're going to create? Deadweight loss, okay? So we'll kind of look at two different things. So here, right, I can calculate my markup. Even when long run profits are 0, I still have a markup. Price is not exactly equal to marginal cost with monopolistic competitive firms. So because I have this markup, we said a perfectly competitive firm, the markup was 0. Price is exactly equal to our marginal cost. So I'm going to have some inefficiencies because these firms now have a markup even when price is equal to average total cost and profits are 0. Okay. Now, what we're also going to look at is a different term. And I think I left this a little bit out of the slide, so there's value added to class, right? So if I think about something like this, so let's say I've got my average total cost curve, and Here's my demand curve. It's down here. Here's my marginal revenue curve. Here's my marginal cost curve. Okay? So marginal cost is hitting average total cost at its minimum point. Okay? So that minimum point, or the efficient scale of production, is going to be where a perfectly competitive firm would end up being in the long run. Okay? Now, they don't face a twice as steep demand curve, right? They had a horizontal demand curve, which is kind of what pushed them to this point where, yes, long run profits are zero, but also we end up at that efficient scale of production, the lowest possible per unit costs. Where do these monopolistically competitive firms end up at? Well, they choose the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. They go up to the demand curve to set the price, right? The price is exactly equal to average total cost, so their profits are equal to zero. Right? So even though perfectly competitive, monopolistic competitive firms will both end up with zero profits, notice what quantity did the monopolistic competitive monopolistic competitive firm end up with? A lower quantity. Okay? So we call this difference between the efficient scale of production, or where perfectly competitive firms end up, and the quantity where monopolistically competitive firms end up. We're going to call this excess capacity, right? It's the number of units that we're restricting quantity by that, leads to higher per unit costs. It's the number of units we should be producing more to get to that efficient scale, or the lowest possible per unit costs. Okay. Any questions on this idea of excess capacity? So what you're going to compare it to is the quantity that's at the minimum point of the average total cost curve. What you won't do, and is easy to kind of get to make some confusion on, you're not comparing it to where supply is equal to demand. Okay. Because at that point, we're still slightly not at that efficient scale of production, and excess capacity is always in reference to that efficient scale of production one, right? That lowest possible point of the average total cost of the. Okay. Any questions on this idea? And the reason why that doesn't occur is because, like, perfectly competitive markets technically, right, have this like horizontal demand curve. So they're not facing the same demand, which is why those 2 points can be different. You don't need to draw that on the graph. I was just. Any questions here before we kind of move to one more topic here? Okay. So we compare it to that efficient scale of production to determine excess capacity. This is where it gets a little bit trickier. If I'm instead thinking about, okay, we're not at that efficient scale of production, right? So we said if we're not at that efficient scale, what's going to be created? Deadweight loss, right? So we'll think through, what does surplus look like for a monopolistic competitive firm? Okay. Now, they chose the quantity, profit maximizing quantity, where marginal revenue was equal to marginal cost. They then went up to the demand curve to set the price. Okay. So let's think about, what is producer surplus? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of the producers. Their benefit is the price they're setting. Their marginal cost, well, we have the marginal cost curve. So producer surplus is going to be the area below price, but above our supply, or above our marginal costs. Right? This looks very similar to how we identified producer surplus when we had a monopolist. Right? Now, what would the value of consumer surplus be? Well, once again, surplus is just the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost, but now specific to consumers. Okay. So here, what's the marginal benefit represented by? Our demand curve. Cost to consumers is the price they're paying. So where is consumer surplus? right here. Okay. Now, if we would have produced, what point would have maximized total surplus? Well, total surplus is simply the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs in the market. We don't care if it's producers or consumers. So we said that's the difference between our supply and demand curve, what represents supply, the firm's marginal costs. We should have been out here at this quantity if we had like a perfectly competitive market that was maximizing total surplus. So what surplus did we miss out on? Everything here. Missing out on surplus, that would be deadweight loss. Okay. So we have some deadweight loss that's going to be created because we had this monopolistically competitive market. Any questions on this idea? So I just want to make a quick comparison to a perfectly competitive market. And I think the intuition here is pretty easy, but we want to look at the visual as well. So I'm trying to draw these kind of exactly the same. So if I had a perfectly competitive market, it's simply going to be where supply is equal to demand, right? What would consumer surplus be here? Difference between the demand curve and the price they pay. So consumer surplus in the perfectly competitive market. What's producer surplus? The difference between the price they receive and their marginal cost or their supply curve. So what has happened to consumer surplus? It's went up, right? So kind of similar to that when we were comparing a perfectly competitive firm to a monopolist. The consumer surplus in a monopolistically competitive market would be greater than that of a perfectly competitive market. Or sorry, I got this written right. Wait, no, sorry. Consumer surplus of the perfectly competitive market is greater than the consumer surplus of a monopolistically competitive market. And that's intuitive, makes sense. If firms have some market power, are consumers going to be better or worse off? Well, we said the monopolist competitive firms can set higher prices. Who is that a bad thing for? Consumers, right? So consumers are going to be worse off if we have a monopolistic competitive market. If I have some market power, who is that a good thing for? Well, who has market power? Firms. You think having market power is a good or a bad thing for firms? Good. So what do we end up seeing? Their producer surplus, we've gained this rectangle, which is going to be smaller than that little triangle that we lost. So very similar when we were comparing monopolies to perfectly competitive markets. Anytime we have any market power, producer surplus goes up, consumer surplus goes down. Also, anytime we have any market power, what are we creating because we're moving away from this perfectly competitive outcome? Deadweight loss. So very similar when we're comparing and contrasting these surplus values in monopoly markets relative to kind of perfectly competitive markets. The same kind of directional changes would exist, monopolistically competitive compared to perfectly competitive markets. Okay. Any questions here? All right. So let me think what I want to do here. So I have a depiction here where we kind of have deadweight loss identified. We kind of already drew this out, so I'm not going to kind of waste time on this. We compared the market surplus values. Maybe next class we'll think about kind of the difference between monopolies and monopolies competitive. I'll kind of talk through them here. So we said there's this deadweight loss. So let's think about where it's coming from. We said when we have these monopolies competitive firms, they're not producing at that efficient scale, right? That lowest possible average total cost. So because we're not at that lowest possible point of the average total cost curve, that's going to create some loss of surplus. We're not operating efficiently for society, right? Total surplus in society isn't going to be maximized. So that's part of where deadweight loss comes from. The other part is from the fact that we know the monopolist competitive firms are now choosing a price that's above their marginal cost, right? So for every unit, what's being charged is above what it's cost. That's going to create some inefficiencies as well, because that higher price is going to cause consumers to buy less than before, right? So this excess capacity and this markup is what is creating this deadweight loss in these monopolistic competitive markets. We didn't really define excess capacity with monopolies. but really there it's a similar idea. They're restricting quantity. They're not at that efficient scale of production. That's part of where deadweight loss is coming from. Okay. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. So we know that in the long run, these monopolist competitive firms are going to have zero profits. We know the price, though, they're setting is above what the perfectly competitive price for this product would be. So how do I regulate these markets? Well, what's one way we said we could regulate monopolists? Even if we had a natural monopoly, we could set we want the price to be lower, we could set a price ceiling. Now, we might not be able to push deadweight loss down to zero, but we can get close. Well, in these monopolistic competitive markets, maybe I could push it down to kind of where it's equal. Oh, wait, can I? If profits are zero and I still have deadweight loss, if I lower the price anymore, what's going to happen to profits? They're going to become negative. The firm leaves, right? Now I have the whole, all that firm's surplus is lost. So I can't really regulate these using prices, right? Because in the long run, unlike a monopolist, they had positive profits. At least I could lower their price, kind of eat into their profits a little bit, and they still want to stay in that industry. The problem is if I have monopolist competitive firms, their long run profits are zero. So if I try to regulate them, I just drive them out of the market. So I can't use these price ceilings, right? And even if I wanted to in the short run, each firm sells a slightly different product. So it's not like every firm has an equal split of demand, and every firm might have a more or less elastic demand curve. So if I want to push every firm, even in the short run, of profits of zero, I'd have to set a different price for every single product, every single firm. That's just, it's not realistic, right? It's impossible, right? So I can't really use these price regulations. It's very difficult to eliminate any deadweight loss in these monopolist competitive markets because firms are already at a profit value of zero in the long run. Okay. So we'll kind of introduce this idea next. Okay, I might want to regulate these markets. I think that there's some deadweight loss that exists, but I can't regulate. Right? Well, we'll go one step. Maybe I could regulate them, right? Instead of price regulations, what's something I could do, right? We have the quantities too low, so we have excess capacity. How can I incentivize production of the product? Subsidies. So the Canvas discussion is going to be kind of related to higher education. So if I think about higher education, IU and Ivy Tech both offer college courses. They sell a very different product, right? So what's the subsidization we see in higher education? Maybe Pell Grants. Well, that's a much smaller proportion of your tuition than it would be for an Ivy Tech student, right? So even the same value of the subsidy would impact these slightly different products differently. And I might want that because I know the demand for an IU education is likely much higher than that of an Ivy Tech, or maybe the characteristics of those consumers who are selecting into those different types of higher education goods might be very different. Now, I could also give subsidies that, maybe instead I have this higher education example. Maybe I know the ability and willingness to pay is higher at a public versus a private institution. So maybe I give subsidies if you're attending a public institution, but not to a private. So I can use subsidies to kind of impact these slightly different products in slightly different ways. So potentially there, we do have some tools to eliminate some of that deadweight loss. But if profits are equal to zero, the only way I can do that is if I essentially fund it as the government. I have to give subsidies, which now, who do subsidies, where do they come from? The government. I've now created deadweight loss in a different dimension, right? So it gets very difficult essentially to regulate these markets. But we can also think about, even though there's deadweight loss that exists in these markets, why might that not be a bad thing for society? Okay. Well, if I think about, there might be externalities. Now, I won't push you this far, but like the next level would be, let's incorporate multiple topics into one model. We've got monopolistic competitive markets where there's deadweight loss in the market, but what could they create? Possibly externalities. Okay. So when I have these monopolistic competitive markets, maybe, maybe if the market is oversaturated, right? If this actually produces a lower quality product because firms are trying to compete so much that maybe there's some kind of business ceiling externalities, I try to create products that prevent other firms from entering. When we see more and more firms kind of enter this market, maybe there's some negative externalities that would exist because the product gets kind of diluted. So maybe they're having fewer firms, lower quantity would actually maybe be a good thing for society. Now, the opposite argument would be if I have more firms, so this is, think about it this way. Let's say we all have to wear the government, I don't know, there's some red, all of us have to, the only product being produced is a red t-shirt. We all have to wear it, right? Well, if that's only one company, that all you can buy is a red t-shirt. Well, why do we all wear different clothes? Because we like different things, like colors, different designs, different tapers, whatever the characteristic of the clothing is, right? Or supports our team or whatever it is. Wearing something that you like more provides you with a higher benefit. So the fact that we have differentiated products, we all don't have to just wear red t-shirt. Every person is now from wearing clothing that is differentiated, getting a higher marginal benefit, or essentially we're creating positive externalities. So maybe having these differentiated products is a good thing. In every market, we don't want a homogeneous product when it comes to clothing. That would piss a lot of us off, right? It would lower our marginal benefit. So some products, we want differentiation because it provides positive externalities. As long as those gains from the positive externalities outweigh the deadweight loss in the market, society is better off. Now, it gets very hard to measure those and determine whether or not, those positive externalities are larger. But that would be one argument as to why we don't necessarily hate the fact that there's monopolistically competitive markets. There are externalities that are potentially created because of this product differentiation. Okay. So, the end result is this gets kind of hard to think about. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into these monopolistic competitive markets, thinking about changes in their cost structure, potentially how the elasticity is related to markups. My guess is we will probably, maybe not the whole second half, but at least like the second or last third of class, I will be doing review questions from those practice finals and likely the ones that are related to monopolistic competitive markets, just to kind of keep the class cohesive. Once again, I then will post a video in replacement of Tuesday's classes where I probably review some of the older material. And then Thursday, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions really over anything that you want. Next Thursday, sorry. So what I want to mention before you guys get too eager and out of here. So I just got information last night about where the final exam location is going to be. So tomorrow you'll see a kind of announcement on Canvas pop up of exactly where our kind of location will be for the final exam. The time is already kind of set. It's in the syllabus. I think it's Wednesday 8 to 10, if I remember off the top of my head correctly, for this class. So you'll see that kind of pop up. If you have an accommodation, I'm still getting information about where that location is at. I will get it to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, any questions? They'll be in my office tomorrow. And I will see you guys then again on Thursday.